The funniest part about getting fined $680 for fishing was that 6 weeks later, I owned the lake. The paper felt warm from the printer when Maggie Holloway slid it across the polished clubhouse table. The sharp smell of coffee and fresh ink hung in the air, while 40 homeowners sat quietly around me pretending not to stare. HOA meetings always had that strange energy, like everyone knew something ridiculous was happening, but nobody wanted to be the first person to say it out loud. I looked down at the violation notice. Unauthorized fishing activity. Fine amount, $680. My name is Ethan Walker, and at that moment I honestly thought it was some kind of joke. I glanced through the clubhouse windows toward the lake shimmering in the late afternoon sun. The water stretched across nearly 70 acres, reflecting the orange sky like a sheet of glass. I'd been fishing that lake since I was 8 years old. My father taught me there. My grandfather taught him there. Every important conversation in my family somehow happened on that shoreline. Yet somehow, according to Maggie and the Willow Creek HOA, I was now being punished for casting a fishing line into it. Maggie folded her hands and gave me that smile. You know the kind. The smile people use when they think they've already won. Community regulations apply equally to everyone. Ethan, she said. Her voice was sweet enough to sell real estate, but somehow managed to sound like a threat at the same time. The room stayed silent. Nobody challenged her. Nobody even looked at me. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the distant splash of something breaking the lake's surface outside. I picked up the violation notice and turned it over. That's when something caught my eye. Behind Maggie, mounted on the clubhouse wall, hung a large framed map of the development. I'd seen it 100 times before, but this time something felt different. Maybe it was the angle. Maybe it was the frustration. Maybe it was pure luck. But I noticed a small marking near the lake boundary that I'd never paid attention to before. Just a tiny notation hidden among property lines and easements. My grandfather used to tell me that maps never lie, only the people reading them do. The memory hit me so suddenly I could almost hear his voice. The smell of old tackle boxes. The creak of weathered dock boards beneath our boots. The gentle slap of water against aluminum boats. One day this lake will matter more than people think, he told me years ago while untangling fishing line from a reel. Back then I thought he was talking about fishing. Looking back now, I realize he wasn't. Maggie cleared her throat. Payment is due within 14 days. The sound pulled me back into the room. I nodded slowly and folded the notice. Not because I agreed with it. Not because I intended to pay it. But because something about that map had started a thought I couldn't shake. The meeting continued. Maggie droned on about landscaping compliance, dock permits, and community standards. I barely heard a word. My eyes kept drifting back to that framed map. The longer I stared at it, the more questions I had. Outside, sunlight danced across the water. Kids rode bicycles along the walking trail. Residents launched kayaks from the community dock. Everyone acted like the lake belonged to the HOA, including me, especially me, because why wouldn't it? There were signs everywhere saying it did. HOA brochures said it did. Maggie certainly acted like it did. But sitting there with that violation notice in my hand, I suddenly realized something strange. In all the years I'd lived there, I'd never actually seen proof. The metallic taste of curiosity settled in the back of my throat. Maggie thought she was teaching me a lesson that afternoon. She thought $680 would remind me who controlled the lake. What she didn't know was that her fine had just made me start asking questions. And sometimes the most expensive mistake a person can make isn't taking someone's money. It's giving them a reason to look closer. I drove straight to my father's old cabin after that meeting instead of going home. The narrow gravel road wound through pine trees that had stood there longer than most of the houses in Willow Creek. The tires crunched beneath my truck, and the familiar sound settled my nerves better than any conversation could have. The cabin sat less than 200 yards from the shoreline, tucked beneath a cluster of oaks that my grandfather planted before I was born. Even after all these years, the place still smelled faintly of cedar, old books, and lake water. Some people inherit money. Some inherit businesses. I inherited stories. Every wall inside that cabin held one. Every scratch on the dock. Every faded photograph. Every fishing lure hanging from a nail above the fireplace. My grandfather, Walter Walker, believed a man should know the history of the land beneath his feet. He kept records of everything. Property surveys. Tax receipts. Newspaper clippings. handwritten notes stuffed into boxes that looked older than I was. Growing up, I thought it was just the habit of an organized old man. Looking back, I realized he was preserving something. The sun was beginning to set when I unlocked the cabin door. Orange light spilled across the wooden floorboards. Dust floated through the air like tiny sparks. Outside, I could hear water lapping against the shoreline and the distant call of a loon somewhere across the lake. The sound immediately pulled me backward through time. I was 8 years old again, sitting on the dock beside my grandfather. My fishing rod was too large for me. My life jacket felt stiff and uncomfortable. I remember complaining about the heat while he laughed and pointed toward the water. "Patience catches more fish than luck ever will," he always said. Back then, I thought he was talking about fishing. Years later, I learned he was talking about almost everything. I walked toward the old bookshelf in the corner. Framed photographs covered the wall beside it. There was one of my father holding a largemouth bass nearly as big as my torso. Another showed my grandparents standing beside the lake in 1978 when the shoreline was still undeveloped farmland. No walking trails, no luxury homes, no clubhouse, no HOA, just water, trees, and open sky. The strange thing was that nobody in my family ever talked about owning the lake. They talked about protecting it, respecting it, taking care of it. The lake was treated almost like a family member. That memory kept bothering me as I stared at the photographs. If the HOA truly controlled everything now, why did my grandfather always speak as though the lake existed outside of their reach? Why had he been so confident whenever developers started buying nearby land? I opened a storage closet and found exactly what I expected. Stacked file boxes labeled by year. Some dated back decades. The cardboard felt rough beneath my fingertips. A faint smell of aging paper drifted into the room. Most people would have spent the evening angry about the fine. I spent mine reading. Hours passed. Outside, darkness settled over the water. The cabin grew quiet except for the ticking of an old wall clock. I sorted through surveys, maintenance records, environmental reports, and county correspondence. Most of it seemed ordinary. Then I found something interesting. Folded between two property assessment files sat an oversized map tube covered in dust. My pulse quickened before I even opened it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was curiosity. I carefully removed the contents and rolled them across the dining table. The paper crackled softly beneath my hands. It was an original survey map, much older than the framed version hanging inside the HOA clubhouse. Several handwritten notes filled the margins. Survey markers, access easements, shoreline boundaries, tiny details that would mean nothing to most people. But one notation immediately grabbed my attention. It matched the same marking I had noticed during the meeting. Exactly the same. I leaned closer beneath the yellow glow of the lamp. Outside, a breeze moved across the lake, rattling leaves against the cabin roof. The air suddenly felt electric. I did not know what the notation meant yet. I only knew it appeared on a map created long before Willow Creek existed. Long before Maggie Holloway became HOA president. Long before anyone started charging residents for access to the water. I stared at that symbol for several seconds while a memory surfaced from somewhere deep in the back of my mind. My grandfather standing on this very porch one summer evening, watching the sun disappear across the lake. His voice calm and certain. "Most people never bother checking who really owns something," he said. "They just assume the loudest person does." At the time, I thought it was one of his random life lessons. Sitting there alone in the cabin, with that old survey spread across the table and the sound of waves brushing against the shore outside, I began to wonder if he had been trying to tell me something all along. The next morning, I drove to the county records office before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. The building sat downtown between an insurance agency and a hardware store that had been there since the 1960s. The smell of old paper and floor polish greeted me the moment I stepped through the door. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, while ceiling fans pushed cool air through rows of filing cabinets. Most people only came here when they were buying property or settling an estate. I came because a tiny symbol on an old map refused to leave my mind. A clerk named Susan pointed me toward the archive room after I explained what I was looking for. She had worked there for nearly 30 years and moved with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly where every document in the county was hiding. Within minutes, I was sitting at a wooden table surrounded by survey records, subdivision filings, and property transfer documents. Hours slipped by. Outside the windows, sunlight moved slowly across the courthouse lawn. Inside, I followed one trail after another. Willow Creek Development Corporation, Shoreline Holdings LLC, Evergreen Community Partners. The names changed every few years like actors rotating through the same role. Developers came and went. Companies merged. Others disappeared entirely. But one detail stayed strangely consistent. The lake itself seemed disconnected from everything around it. Every residential parcel had changed hands multiple times. Roads had been transferred. Common areas had been reassigned. Recreational facilities had been updated. Yet the lake remained separate. By noon, curiosity had turned into obsession. I bought a sandwich from a deli across the street and brought it back to the records room. The paper wrapper crackled as I flipped through another stack of filings. Then I found Maggie Holloway's favorite document, the HOA Master Declaration. The very document she referenced every time she wanted to find someone, regulate something, or remind residents who was supposedly in charge. I read every page carefully. Then I read it again. The air conditioner rattled somewhere above me. My sandwich sat untouched beside the table. And slowly, a strange realization settled over me. The declaration talked endlessly about lake access, lake maintenance, lake amenities, lake rules. But nowhere did it actually say the HOA owned the lake. Not once. The language was clever, deliberately clever. It created the impression of ownership without ever directly claiming it. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. For years, residents had accepted every rule because they assumed the HOA controlled the water. I had assumed it too. Everybody had. The difference between control and ownership suddenly felt enormous. Late that afternoon, I uncovered another filing buried inside a bankruptcy record from nearly 20 years earlier. The paper was yellowed around the edges. A faded stamp crossed the corner. My pulse quickened as I scanned the page. There it was again. The same legal description from my grandfather's map. The same boundary notation. The same parcel number. Except this time the document revealed something far more important. The lake was still listed as a separate asset. Not HOA property. Not county property. Not public property. A separate asset owned by a company that no longer actively existed. I read the paragraph 3 times just to make sure I was not imagining it. The room suddenly felt very quiet. The kind of silence that arrives when a puzzle piece finally clicks into place. Outside, traffic rolled past the courthouse. Somewhere down the hall a copier started running. I could hear every sound. The lake had never been transferred into HOA ownership. Somehow, through decades of development, paperwork, and assumptions, that final step had never happened. I requested additional records before leaving. Susan returned carrying a thin folder and set it on the table. Funny property, she said casually. People ask about the houses all the time. Nobody ever asks about the water. I opened the folder. Inside was a recent filing from a court-appointed trustee handling the remains of the old development company. My eyes stopped on a single line. Scheduled asset disposition review. Pending liquidation. I felt my heartbeat speed up. The smell of old paper seemed sharper now. The words almost glowed on the page. The lake was not just separate. It was heading towards sale. For years, Maggie had acted like a queen standing on inherited land. For years, the HOA collected fees, enforced rules, and behaved as though ownership was unquestionable. Yet sitting there in that archive room with decades of records spread across the table, I realized something they clearly had not. The foundation beneath their authority was not nearly as solid as they believed. For the next 2 weeks, I kept my discovery to myself. That turned out to be the easiest part. The harder part was pretending nothing had changed while Maggie continued expanding her little empire around the lake. Every morning, another announcement appeared in resident email inboxes. New access policies. New permit requirements. New recreational fees. The woman treated the shoreline like a private country club she personally owned. One Saturday, I walked the perimeter trail just after sunrise. The air smelled like wet grass and lake water. A thin layer of fog hovered above the surface while the first rays of sunlight painted the water gold. It should have been peaceful. Instead, bright new signs had appeared along the shoreline. HOA authorized activities only. Resident permit required. Unapproved fishing subject to penalties. I stopped beside one of the signs and shook my head. The metal post had been installed less than 20 feet from the same dock where my father taught me how to tie a fishing knot. Nearby, A retired teacher named Harold sat quietly on a bench staring at the water. I knew Harold well enough to notice he looked irritated. "What happened?" I asked. He let out a slow breath. "They charged me $75 for launching my kayak without registering it." I thought he was joking. He was not. By the end of our conversation, I learned a family had been fined for holding a picnic near the shoreline. Another resident had received a warning for feeding ducks. A teenager had been told he needed approval paperwork to use a paddleboard. Every story sounded more ridiculous than the last. The strange thing was that nobody fought back. They grumbled. They complained. Then they paid. Because everyone believed the same thing. They believed the HOA owned the lake. The illusion was so complete that nobody questioned it anymore. A few days later, I attended another HOA meeting. This time I sat quietly near the back. The clubhouse smelled like fresh carpet cleaner and expensive coffee. Maggie stood at the front of the room wearing a bright blue blazer and the expression of someone completely comfortable with authority. A large presentation screen displayed charts showing increased lake revenue. She looked proud of the numbers. "Our waterfront amenities program continues exceeding expectations," she announced. Several board members nodded enthusiastically. Revenue. That word caught my attention. Not maintenance. Not conservation. Revenue. Maggie spent 20 minutes discussing permit fees, access passes, event charges, and registration programs. The more she spoke, the clearer the picture became. The lake was not just a recreational asset anymore. It had become the financial centerpiece of the HOA. Every new rule generated another stream of money. Every restriction created another opportunity to collect fees. Then came the moment that nearly made me laugh. Maggie pointed toward a slide showing projected revenue growth for the next 5 years. "Our lake remains the community's most valuable asset," she said confidently. Several people applauded. I lowered my eyes and stared at the meeting agenda so nobody would see the smile trying to form on my face. Because I now knew something Maggie did not. She kept calling it our lake. Legally speaking, it was not hers. It was not the HOA's. It belonged to a forgotten corporate shell sitting inside a trustee's liquidation file downtown. Yet Maggie was making long-term financial plans based on property she did not actually own. The confidence was almost impressive. After the meeting ended, residents gathered in small groups discussing upcoming lake events. Maggie moved through the room accepting compliments and shaking hands. Her perfume lingered in the air as she passed. She looked completely untouchable, completely secure, completely certain that nobody would ever challenge her authority. As I walked toward the exit, I glanced at the framed map hanging on the wall. The same map that had started everything. This time I noticed something else. A small notation had been covered by a decorative plaque installed directly over part of the survey boundary. Most people would never have noticed it. But now I could not stop noticing details. Outside, evening sunlight reflected across the water. Families strolled along the shoreline. Children laughed near the docks. The entire community revolved around that lake. Maggie understood that. The HOA understood that. What they did not understand was how vulnerable their position actually was. Because while they were busy collecting fees and celebrating future profits, I had already scheduled a meeting with the court-appointed trustee handling the asset liquidation. And for the first time since receiving that ridiculous violation notice, I felt something stronger than curiosity. I felt opportunity. The trustee's office occupied the 3rd floor of an aging brick building overlooking the courthouse square. The elevator groaned its way upward while the smell of old carpet and copier toner filled the narrow hallway. I arrived 10 minutes early carrying a folder thick enough to make my shoulder ache. Years of environmental consulting had taught me one simple lesson. Important decisions rarely happen because somebody makes a great speech. They happen because somebody shows up with the paperwork. The trustee, a gray-haired attorney named Richard Coleman, greeted me with a firm handshake and the tired expression of a man who had spent decades untangling other people's financial disasters. His office window faced west toward the lake. I could actually see a sliver of blue water between the rooftops downtown. We spent nearly an hour reviewing records, bankruptcy filings, asset schedules, property descriptions, historical surveys. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. The lake remained listed as a separate asset within the liquidation estate. No transfer had ever been completed. No ownership assignment had ever reached the HOA. No missing page suddenly appeared to save Maggie's assumptions. The legal reality was exactly what the records suggested. Then Richard opened a folder and slid a document across the desk. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Scheduled Asset Disposition Review. Estimated Valuation. Proposed Sale Procedures. My eyes moved down the page line by line. The lake was heading toward public sale. Not next year. Not someday. Soon. Richard explained the process calmly while I listened. Interested buyers could submit offers. The estate would evaluate proposals. The highest qualifying bidder would likely secure ownership. Simple. Legal. Completely routine. Yet as he spoke, I kept thinking about the HOA clubhouse. The permits. The fees. The signs. The speeches about community assets. Maggie acted like ownership was a settled question. Meanwhile, the actual property was quietly approaching the market without anyone seeming to notice. Has the Homeowners Association contacted you? I finally asked. Richard adjusted his glasses and checked his notes. Not that I am aware of. I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was unbelievable. The organization that claimed authority over every fishing rod, kayak, picnic table, and dock on the shoreline had apparently never bothered to verify ownership. The meeting ended shortly after noon. Outside, summer heat radiated from the sidewalks. The smell of fresh asphalt drifted from a nearby paving project while traffic rolled through downtown intersections. I sat inside my truck for several minutes, staring at the folder resting on the passenger seat. Opportunity had become something more concrete now. For weeks I had been gathering information. Now I had confirmation. A path existed. The only question was whether I was willing to follow it. That evening I drove to the cabin again. The lake was calm. Sunset painted the water in shades of orange and gold while crickets started their nightly chorus along the shoreline. I carried the folder onto the dock and sat in the same weathered chair my grandfather used to occupy. The wood creaked beneath my weight. Gentle waves tapped against the pilings below. Across the water, lights from Willow Creek began appearing one by one. Hundreds of residents enjoying a lake they believed belonged to the HOA. A strange mixture of emotions settled over me. Part excitement, part disbelief, part responsibility. Because this was no longer about a fine. It was not even about Maggie anymore. It was about something larger. If the HOA acquired the lake first, every fee, restriction, and regulation would become permanent. The control they exercised now would only grow stronger. I thought about Harold and his kayak permit. The family fine for a picnic. The teenager with the paddleboard. Every unnecessary rule. Every unnecessary charge. The breeze carried the smell of pine trees across the water as darkness slowly settled over the shoreline. Then my phone buzzed. A community email notification. Another message from Maggie. Another new policy. Another new fee. This time residents would need annual registration stickers for personal watercraft. I stared at the screen for several seconds before setting it face down beside me. Somewhere across the lake, Maggie was probably congratulating herself on another successful improvement. What she did not realize was that every new restriction pushed me closer to making a decision. And for the first time since discovering the truth, I stopped asking whether buying the lake was possible. I started asking how quickly I could make it happen. The decision became real on a Thursday afternoon when I sat across from my financial advisor and watched numbers fill a conference room screen. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the smell of coffee drifted from a machine in the corner. For the first time, this was no longer a theory buried in county records. It was a transaction, an actual possibility with actual numbers attached to it. The lake was valuable, but not nearly as valuable as most people assumed. That surprised me. People saw the water, the docks, the walking trails, and the expensive homes surrounding it and automatically imagined a massive price tag. The reality was more complicated. The lake required maintenance, insurance, environmental compliance, shoreline management. To most investors, it looked like a responsibility disguised as an asset. To me, it looked different. I understood water systems. I understood conservation. More importantly, I understood exactly why the lake mattered to the community. By the end of the meeting, I knew I could do it. Not comfortably, not casually, but legally and realistically. The moment I walked out into the parking lot, I felt the weight of the decision settle onto my shoulders. Warm summer air greeted me. Cars moved through the intersection nearby. Somewhere across town, Maggie was probably preparing another newsletter about community improvements. She had no idea that the future of her favorite asset was quietly changing direction. Over the next several days, I moved carefully. I created a holding company, hired a real estate attorney, reviewed environmental reports, examined shoreline obligations. Every evening ended the same way, sitting on the old dock outside the cabin while the sun disappeared across the water. The lake seemed different now, not because it had changed, because I had. I was no longer looking at it as a resident. I was looking at it as someone preparing to take responsibility for it. One evening, I found myself staring at the framed photograph of my grandfather hanging above the fireplace. The glass reflected orange sunset light from the window behind me. He looked exactly the way I remembered. Calm, patient, certain, the kind of man who never rushed a decision. I thought about all the years he spent protecting this place, all the records he preserved, all the maps he saved. Suddenly, the strange comments he used to make started fitting together. He had never spoken about the lake like a public amenity. He had spoken about it like something worth watching carefully, something worth understanding. The following week brought another HOA meeting. This one was bigger than usual. Residents filled nearly every chair in the clubhouse. The smell of fresh pastries mixed with expensive perfume, while conversations echoed off the walls. Maggie stood at the front of the room, smiling confidently. Behind her, a slideshow displayed plans for expanded lake programming, new boating permits, additional registration fees, premium shoreline events. Every slide seemed to involve collecting money from residents in exchange for using water they supposedly already owned together. The applause at the end of her presentation sounded polite rather than enthusiastic. People were growing frustrated. I could feel it. Yet nobody challenged her directly. The illusion still held. Ownership remained unquestioned. During the meeting, Maggie announced projected revenue increases for the next 3 years. The numbers flashed across the screen. She spoke about long-term planning, future investments, expanded authority. Listening to her felt surreal. She was building a future around assumptions that were becoming less accurate every day. I sat quietly and took notes. Not because I needed the information, because patience catches more than luck ever will. My grandfather's voice echoed inside my head once again. Afterward, residents gathered around refreshments while Maggie accepted compliments. She looked completely relaxed, completely secure. One board member even joked that nobody would ever challenge the HOA's control of the lake. Several people laughed. I almost did too. Not out of arrogance, out of disbelief. Because earlier that same afternoon, my attorney had called with an update. The asset review process was moving forward faster than expected. Qualified offers would soon be accepted. The window was opening. As I drove home that night, the lake reflected moonlight through the trees beside the road. The water looked calm and silent. Yet beneath that calm surface, everything was changing. Maggie thought she was tightening her grip. The board thought their authority was expanding. The residents thought the future had already been decided. But somewhere inside a trustee's office downtown, paperwork was moving from one desk to another. Signatures were being prepared. Deadlines were approaching. And with every passing day, I moved one step closer to becoming something nobody in Willow Creek would ever expect. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing environmental reports in my office. The ringtone cut through the quiet hum of the air conditioner, and the moment I saw my attorney's name on the screen, I knew something had happened. Outside the window, summer sunlight reflected off parked cars while sprinklers clicked rhythmically across a nearby lawn. Everything looked ordinary. My life stopped feeling ordinary about 30 seconds into that conversation. The trustee had officially opened the submission process. Qualified offers were now being accepted. The window was smaller than expected. The timeline was moving faster than expected. And most importantly, no offer had yet been submitted by the Homeowners Association. After we ended the call, I sat motionless for a moment staring at my desk. The smell of fresh paper and coffee filled the room. Months earlier, I would have laughed if someone told me I would be preparing to acquire a 70-acre lake. Yet here I was reviewing purchase structures and legal documents before lunch. The next few days became a blur of meetings, signatures, and planning. Every document seemed to generate 3 more documents. Every phone call led to another conference call. I formed the holding company, finalized financing arrangements, completed due diligence reviews. My attorney moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times before. I moved with the nervous energy of someone who understood exactly how much was at stake. Through it all, I told nobody. Not my neighbors, not my friends, not a single resident inside Willow Creek. The fewer people who knew, the better. Information spreads quickly in communities like ours. Faster than weather forecasts. Faster than facts. Faster than common sense. Meanwhile, Maggie continued behaving exactly as she always had. If anything, her confidence seemed to be growing. Every week brought another announcement. Another policy update. Another fee structure. One evening, an email arrived introducing a premium shoreline reservation program. Residents would now pay additional charges for access to certain waterfront areas during holiday weekends. I stared at the message while sitting on the cabin porch overlooking the water. Crickets chirped from the shoreline. The smell of pine drifted through the evening air. Somewhere across the lake, lights from expensive homes reflected across the calm surface. Maggie was monetizing every square foot she could reach. The irony almost felt unbelievable. She was expanding control over property she did not own while I was quietly preparing an offer to purchase it. Two worlds moving toward the same destination without realizing it. A week later, I attended another community gathering near the clubhouse. Food trucks lined the parking lot. Families wandered between vendor tents. Children played near the shoreline. The scent of barbecue floated through the warm evening air. Maggie stood near the waterfront greeting residents like a mayor during election season. A banner stretched across the lawn promoting the upcoming Willow Creek Lake Heritage Festival. According to the advertisements, it would be the largest community celebration in neighborhood history. Maggie clearly intended to make it a showcase event. New permits, new attractions, new revenue opportunities. Everything centered around the lake. Listening to her speak felt surreal now. Every sentence carried assumptions built upon foundations that no longer looked stable. Yet nobody questioned her. Why would they? From the outside, everything appeared normal. She looked successful. The board looked organized. The events looked popular. Only a handful of people in the entire county knew what was actually happening behind the scenes. As August approached, my attorney delivered the news I had been waiting for. Our offer package was complete. Every financial review had been approved. Every legal requirement had been satisfied. We were ready. The email arrived late in the afternoon while rain tapped softly against the cabin windows. I read it twice, then a third time. Ready. Such a simple word. Yet it carried the weight of everything that had happened since that ridiculous violation notice landed in my hands. The maps, the records, the trustee meetings, the long nights on the dock, the stories my grandfather used to tell. All of it had led here. I walked outside carrying a cup of coffee and stood at the end of the dock while rain rippled across the water. The lake stretched into the gray distance beneath low clouds. Quiet, patient, unchanged. My grandfather used to say that water never rushes. It simply follows its course until it reaches the place it was always meant to go. Standing there in the rain, watching circles spread across the surface, I realized the same thing was happening now. Maggie thought she was preparing for a celebration. The board thought they were preparing for another profitable year. The residents thought they were preparing for a festival. None of them realized they were also preparing for the biggest surprise Willow Creek had seen since the neighborhood was built. The morning of the Willow Creek Lake Heritage Festival arrived with clear skies and the kind of perfect weather real estate brochures dream about. Sunlight sparkled across the water. American flags fluttered from dock posts. Food vendors unloaded coolers while volunteers arranged folding chairs across the lawn. The smell of grilled burgers, fresh lemonade, and cut grass drifted through the air. Families filled the shoreline before 9 o'clock. Children chased each other between vendor tents. Kayaks floated near the docks. Music played softly through speakers mounted around the clubhouse. To everyone else, it looked like a celebration. To me, it felt like the final chapter of a very long story. I parked near the back of the lot and sat inside my truck for a moment. On the passenger seat rested a leather folder containing documents that had taken months to assemble. Beside it sat a smaller envelope from my attorney. The transaction had officially closed 48 hours earlier. Every signature was complete. Every filing had been recorded. Every transfer had been verified. Legally speaking, everything had already changed. The community simply did not know it yet. As I stepped onto the grass, the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. Maggie stood near the main stage greeting residents. She wore a bright white blazer and carried herself with the confidence of someone expecting applause. Several board members moved through the crowd collecting compliments about the event. The entire shoreline had been decorated with banners celebrating community ownership and waterfront tradition. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. By noon, hundreds of residents had gathered around the stage. Folding chairs filled every available space. Additional spectators stood beneath shade tents overlooking the lake. The water shimmered behind them like polished glass. Maggie stepped to the microphone first. Applause rolled through the crowd. She smiled and began delivering the kind of speech she clearly enjoyed giving. She talked about community values, future investments, responsible management, long-term planning. Every few minutes, she referred to the lake as the foundation of Willow Creek's future. The crowd listened politely. Some applauded. Others checked their phones. I stood near the back beside my attorney and waited. The breeze carried the smell of sunscreen and lake water across the lawn. My heart remained surprisingly calm. Not because I was fearless, because months of preparation had replaced uncertainty with facts. Eventually, Maggie reached the conclusion of her speech. She thanked the board, thanked the volunteers, thanked the residents. Then she announced several new waterfront initiatives scheduled for the coming year. Additional permit programs, expanded access regulations, new reservation systems, more fees, more controls, more assumptions. When the applause faded, my attorney quietly looked at me and nodded. It was time. We walked toward the stage together. At first, nobody seemed to understand what was happening. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. The crowd grew noticeably quieter. Maggie looked mildly confused as we approached. Her smile remained in place, but only barely. My attorney introduced himself and requested a moment to address the community regarding a property matter affecting the lake. The word property immediately caught everyone's attention. Silence settled across the lawn. Even the children seemed quieter. My attorney opened his folder and began speaking. His voice carried clearly through the microphone. He explained the historical ownership structure, the bankruptcy estate, the trustee review process, the separate asset classification. Each sentence felt like another piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Faces throughout the crowd shifted from curiosity to confusion. Several board members exchanged nervous glances. Maggie's expression tightened slightly. Then came the sentence nobody expected. The lake had been sold. Not scheduled for sale. Not pending sale. Sold. A ripple moved through the audience. Confused whispers spread through the crowd. My attorney continued calmly. Ownership had legally transferred. The deed had been recorded. The transaction had been finalized. Then he spoke my name. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me at the same moment. I still remember the silence that followed. Not dramatic silence. Not movie silence. Real silence. The kind that happens when people suddenly realize the story they believed is no longer accurate. Maggie looked at me as though she had never seen me before. The board members stared openly. Residents glanced from me to the lake and back again. Across the water, sunlight reflected off the surface exactly as it had every day before. Yet everything felt different now. Because for the first time, the truth was standing in front of everyone. The assumptions were gone. The paperwork existed. The transfer was complete. And the lake that had generated years of rules, fees, permits, and authority no longer belonged to the people who thought they controlled it. For several seconds after the announcement, nobody moved. The breeze continued pushing gentle waves against the shoreline. Music from a nearby speaker faded into awkward silence. Somewhere behind the crowd, a vendor dropped a tray and the metallic clatter echoed across the lawn. That was the first sound anyone seemed to notice. Then the whispers started. Small conversations spread through the audience like ripples moving across water. Residents turned toward one another asking questions. Board members huddled together. Phones appeared from pockets. Faces that had looked relaxed moments earlier now carried expressions of confusion and disbelief. Maggie remained near the stage, frozen between shock and calculation. She was clearly trying to understand how something so important had happened without her knowledge. My attorney calmly answered questions for nearly half an hour. He explained the transfer process, the recorded deed, the trustee sale, the legal chain of ownership. Every answer led to another question, but one fact never changed. The lake now belonged to a different owner. Not the HOA, not the board, not the collection of committees and regulations that had grown around it over the years. The legal reality was finally visible. By sunset, the festival had become less of a celebration and more of a community meeting. Residents wanted information. They wanted clarity. Most of all, they wanted to know what happened next. The answer arrived over the following weeks. Contrary to what many people expected, I did not rush to create new fees. I did not install gates. I did not replace one form of control with another. Instead, I started by reviewing every permit program, every access restriction, and every waterfront charge that had accumulated over the years. The deeper I looked, the more unnecessary many of them appeared. Some had been created to solve problems that no longer existed. Others seemed designed primarily to generate revenue. One crisp September morning, I walked the shoreline carrying a toolbox and a stack of printed notices. The air smelled like fallen leaves and fresh water. Geese moved across the lake in neat formations, while sunlight reflected through trees beginning to turn gold. One by one, I stopped beside the signs that had frustrated residents for years. The permit warnings, the unnecessary restrictions, the notices threatening penalties for ordinary recreational activities. By lunchtime, many of them were gone. Not because rules disappeared entirely. Every property requires responsible management, but because common sense returned. Residents no longer needed special permission to enjoy a peaceful afternoon beside the water. Harold launched his kayak without paying $75. Families held picnics near the shoreline. Teenagers carried paddleboards to the dock without worrying about paperwork. The atmosphere changed almost immediately. The lake started feeling like part of the community again, rather than a source of constant regulation. As for Maggie, reality proved far less dramatic than rumors suggested. She remained a resident. She remained a neighbor. But her influence changed considerably. Residents who had once accepted every statement without question began asking harder questions. Board meetings became more transparent. Financial decisions received greater scrutiny. The assumption that authority should never be challenged quietly disappeared. One evening several months later, I returned to the cabin after finishing work. The lake was perfectly still. The surface reflected the orange glow of sunset, so clearly it looked like polished glass. I walked onto the old dock, carrying a fishing rod and a small tackle box. The same tackle box my grandfather used decades earlier. The hinges squeaked exactly the way I remembered. The smell of aged wood mixed with clean lake air. Everything felt familiar. I sat in the weathered chair at the end of the dock and cast a line into the water. The lure landed with a soft splash. Gentle ripples spread outward. Across the lake, lights began appearing in windows throughout Willow Creek. Families were cooking dinner. Children were finishing homework. Boats rested quietly beside docks. Life moved forward. As I watched the sun sink lower, my eyes drifted toward the old map hanging inside the cabin. The map that started everything. The tiny notation. The forgotten records. The lesson hidden inside decades of paperwork. My grandfather had been right all along. Most people never bother checking who really owns something. They simply assume the loudest person does. A fish tugged lightly on the line, and I smiled. Not because I had won. Because the lake had. The place my family loved. The place generations had protected. The place that taught me patience. In the end, the biggest mistake the HOA ever made was not sending me a fine. It was giving me a reason to look closer. And once I did, the truth was sitting there the entire time, waiting patiently beneath the surface.